being a soldier than he was a lover, and that, of course, would be the next stage of a man's life. Then a soldier, full of strange oaths. Strange oaths, see? Well, as I look back on my days as Chief of the United States Army Scouts, I can honestly admit that in time of skirmish or battle, myself and my fellows, well, yeah, we could have made a few strange oaths a time or two. Old Bill, he wrote about a king who was leading his men into battle one day, and they were greatly outnumbered on that battlefield, and I think the reason they succeeded was because of those strange oaths when their king said, "We would not die in that man's company that fears his fellowship to die with us." This day is called the Feast of Crispian. He that shall see this day and live to old age will yearly on the vigil feast his neighbors and say, "Tomorrow is St. Crispian." Then will he strip his sleeve and show his scars and say, these wounds I had on Crispian's day." Old men forget, yet all shall be forgot. But he will remember with advantages what feats he did that day. Then shall our names, familiar in his mouth as household words, Harry the King, Bedford, Exeter, Warwick and Talbot, Salisbury and Gloucester, be in their flowing cups freshly remembered. And this story shall the good man teach his son, and Crispian shall ne'er go by from this day forward to the ending of the world, but we in it shall be remembered. We few, we happy, we band of brothers. For he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother, be he ne'er so vile. This day shall gentle his condition. And gentlemen in England now abed will think themselves accursed they were not here, and hold their manhood cheap, whilst any speaks that fought with us here upon St. Crispin's Day. Now, like I said, folks, it was those strange oaths of King Henry that I think enabled them to get off the battlefield successfully. A soldier full of strange oaths, bearded like the pard, jealous in honor, sudden and quick in quarrel, seeking the bubble reputation even in the cannon's mouth. Now, if I'm honest, I'll tell you all, I've never gone headlong willingly into the business end of a cannon just to seek some revenge. But I do know what that feeling is like. And when you know, old Bill, he wrote about another soldier whose friend had been murdered, and he spoke to seeking that revenge. "Oh, pardon me, thou bleeding piece of earth, that I am but meek and gentle with these butchers. Thou art the ruins of the noblest man that ever lived in the tide of times. Woe to the hands that shed this costly blood. O'er thy wounds do I now prophesy, which like dumb mouths do ope their ruby lips to beg the voice and utterance of my tongue. Fierce civil strife shall cumber all the parts of Italy. Blood and destruction will be so in use that mothers will but smile when they hold their infants quartered by the hands of war, and all pity choked of custom of foul deeds, with Caesar's spirit come hot from hell, with a tay by his side, shall cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war, that this foul deed shall smell above all the earth, with carrion men groaning for burial." That particular soldier was a man by the name of Mark Antony, speaking about the cruel way in which his dear friend Julius Caesar had just been murdered. He would go on to become a judge, and then a justice. With good tapen line, beard, formal cut, eyes severe, and so he plays his part. Now, I've never been a justice or even a justice of the peace, but I do know what it's like to seek a bit of justice for yourself. You see, it wasn't too long ago that there was an incident in the Oregon Territory, a massacre, if you will, that took place at the Whitman Mission. My youngest daughter, Mary, was yet to find any sign of her or the men responsible for her disappearance that day. Some folks say it's fortunate for the men that are responsible for the Whitman massacre that I haven't found them yet. Old Bill wrote about a merchant, a fellow kind of like me, selling wares to people coming down the trail, and he puts that into words a little bit better than I ever could. To bait fish withal, if it will feed nothing, it will feed my revenge. He hath hindered me of 500,000, mocked my gains, scorned my losses, cooled my friends, heated my enemies, and why? What is his reason? Oh, that I am a Jew. Well, hath not a Jew eyes, hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions, fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer that a Christian is? Why, if you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you were to prick us, would we not bleed? If we resemble you in the rest, well then, if a Jew wrong a Christian, what is his humility? Revenge. Well then, if a Christian wrong a Jew, what should his sufferance be by Christian example? Why, revenge. The villainy you teach me, gentlemen, I will execute, and it shall go hard. But I will better the instruction. Now, after seeking justice, old Bill shifts into the sixth age of a man's life, with spectacles on nose and pouch on side. Now, I don't have any spectacles to play this next here fellow, but imagine, if you will, a lean, hunched-over man that's been withered by both time and disease. He has been in his day a schoolboy, a lover, a fighter, a soldier, but his true desire is to one day be king, and he will stop at nothing to achieve that ultimate goal. He has become the hated, and ma'am, I do mean hated and despised, King Richard III. Now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by this son of yours. And all the clouds that have lowered upon our house now lie deep in the bosom of the ocean buried. Now our stern alarums changed to merry meetings, our brooded arms hung up for monuments. Now, instead of mounting barbed steeds to fright the souls of fearful adversaries, he doth caper nimbly to the lady's bedchamber, to the lascivious pleasings of a lute. But I that am not shaped for sportive tricks, nor made to look upon an amorous looking glass, I that am sent before my time into this cruel breeding world scarce half made up, and so rudely stamped that the dogs do bark at me as I hope by them. Now, this morning when I shared that particular piece, one fellow in the back, he stood up and said, "Gosh, that fellow Shakespeare, I think he's the only poet I've seen that was ever fed on raw meat." To tell you the truth, I don't really care much for that Richard fellow or his story. The first time I heard it was a Captain J. Lee Campebell. He was reading it to me when we were holed up in Fort Laramie in the winter of 1863. Now, I told Campebell I didn't want to hear any more talk of a man who was cruel enough to kill his own mother. And believe it or not, he got even worse before he entered that final stage of a man's life, with spectacles on nose and pouch on side, his youthful hose well saved for a world too wide for his shrunk shape, his big, manly voice turning again towards childish trebles, bells, and whistles in his sound. Last scene of all that ends this strange, eventful history is a second childishness and mere oblivion. Sans teeth, sans eyes, sans taste. Well, sans everything. Richard wasn't the only evil king old Bill wrote about. He wrote about another one, and he spoke about this final stage of a man's lifetime after the untimely death of his wife. She should have died hereafter. Then there would have been time for such a word. today to the last syllable of recorded time. Out, out, brief candle. Life is but a walking shadow, a poor player who struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Well, folks, I do believe it's time I'm heard no more. Hope you've enjoyed some storytelling from two of the greatest storytellers ever, at least ways in my opinion. Now, you need advice on what to take with you, or maybe you need a map of where to go next, you be sure to come and ask old Gabe. Nobody knows the territory around here better than me. Thank you very much. For those of you that don't know, I am Stephan Zacharias, and I am a museum educator here at the Campbell County Rockpile Museum. Brought back a piece that I created quite a few years ago after reading Stanley Vestal's book, Jim Bridger Mountain Man. It was copyrighted in 1947. Stanley Vestal is the pen name of the World War I vet Walter S. Campbell, who is interred now at Custer's National Cemetery up there at the site of the Battle of Little Bighorn, Battle of Greasy Grass up there in Montana. He was from Oklahoma, so why is he buried in Montana? Well, he wrote a lot of books, not just this one. And he was adopted into the Lakota after writing his book about Chief Sitting Bull. He also wrote many other books about the American West and the Great Plains. And so he requested that he be buried in that National Cemetery as opposed to the one closer to home in Oklahoma. I found that out a few weeks ago when I was just walking the road up there. Saw his name and went, why is that here? Because the last time I saw it was in 2003 when I put this piece together. I arranged this for a couple of reasons. Merry Christmas. I arranged this because I was asked to create a program about the American West that dealt with education. So this worked out quite well for this weekend because Mr. Insler will be here at 7 o'clock tonight to talk about his book, which is a big gap between these two and not much written in between them. The cool thing about Mr. Vestal's is that he had an advantage that Mr. Insler did not. He was able to interview people who are still alive that had firsthand experiences with Bridger at his fort or in the U.S. Army. So he's able to get direct quotes that you wouldn't have been able to get any other way. The other thing that I always tell people, if you want to know how they talked back then, get this book. He didn't have a word processing system with spell check. He wrote it as people talked. So E's and A's get reversed. R's may or may not be included in the word itself. So it is a pretty good example. If you just start reading out loud to yourself, you'll start picking up the accent of how these guys talk. Now, when you came to Fort Bridger, especially later in his life, Jim Bridger would tell you stories of an arm of the Pacific Ocean that's completely surrounded by desert, one of his favorite places to escape to. He would also talk about rivers that ran hot and cold, so hot that you could throw meat in and fish it back out almost instantly, and it would be cooked. He would also talk of mountains made of glass that you could shoot and shoot and shoot at that glass face, not realizing it's the reflection of an animal in a direction that's probably somewhere behind you, not in the direction you were actually shooting. He became known for telling tall tales, lies. In today's vernacular, he would be the original source of fake news. And he didn't really take to that too well. So one of the things, at the advice of many of the members of the Army and other friends of his, he did trade for an 1864 copy of William Shakespeare, much like this one, a yoke box and rated at $125. I got this on eBay for $34.95, so I got a deal. I didn't have to give up any auction, and I saved myself quite a bit of money. But he couldn't read. He couldn't write. He was an excellent map maker, Some of his maps are still used as references today. He could speak about a dozen languages. That included native languages. The reasons he was able to go unmolested in Ute territory around the Great Salt Lake was because he could speak and interact with them, and they allowed this white man to go unmolested amongst their region. He was able to do that all throughout the Rocky Mountains and the Great Plains, communicating. Well, he ended up learning Shakespeare by paying a young German boy, 12 to 13 years old, $40 a month to read it to him, and he learned through oratory recitation. Just because you traveled the Oregon Trail for 3 to 6 months of your life didn't mean you get out of school for that long. Somebody was responsible for your education. They would use Shakespeare or the Bible. Each morning you'd be assigned a passage. That educator would read aloud to you before breakfast. You would then proceed until the noonday break, at which you had to report to your educator and recite back to them what you had been read to that morning. If you were unsuccessful, you spent that noonday break working on your oratory recitation so you could try again before dinner, so you didn't go to bed really hungry that day. And then the whole process starts over the next day. Sonnets, monologues, and verses of the Bible were popular educational tools. That's how Shakespeare learned. That's how Bridger learned Shakespeare. Now, the interesting thing is from first-hand accounts, Bridger was so good at reciting Shakespeare and iambic pentameter that he could ad-lib and provide his own commentary, and unless you had a script in front of you, you didn't know which were the lines of Shakespeare and which were the commentary of Bridger himself. That's something that Shakespeare actors find nearly impossible even in 2021. So for him to be able to do that is interesting, and the most famous of which is from the Henry plays. For whatever reason, Bridger had it out for Falstaff. He didn't like him very much. He thought he imbibed in spirituous liquors too much. He had too big of an ego. He was too full of himself, so he would change the name to Mr. Fullstuff instead of Falstaff. Now, the interesting thing is all the things that Bridger complains about Falstaff are the things that people complain about Bridger. He has an ego. He drinks too much. He's full of himself. And one such instance came to head here in Wyoming on the Green River in 1837 at the Green River Rendezvous. Lord William Drummond Stewart had a facsimile or replica suit of armor, English armor, made up right down to the chainmail. He put it in a cargo box. They shipped it across the Atlantic Ocean. Once they arrived on the East Coast, he had his men loaded into a wagon, much to their chagrin and complaint. And then they hauled it overland to southwest Wyoming on the Green River for the 1837 Green River Rendezvous, where an entire suit of armor by Lord Stewart was presented to Jim Bridger, who immediately put it on over the top of his buckskin, chainmail and all, and drunkenly got on the back of his horse and paraded around the camp with a terrible British accent. Fortunately, Alfred Miller was also there, sketching the events of the 1837 Green River Rendezvous, and so this image of Bridger on his horse in a full suit of English armor was sketched from life by Alfred Miller at that rendezvous. So that's just a little bit of fun that we had, that I had putting this together about Jim Bridger. I'll be willing to stick around. I'm here all day. Talk to you one-on-one, answer any questions you might have. Otherwise, please come back at 7 o'clock for Mr. English presentation. It'll be back in the Campbell County room, in the big room back there. Please enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Is the book available besides Jerry's?
Jerry's is available here. Unfortunately, no. I got this off the Amazon.
Okay.
Still trying to work with Penny to see if University of Nebraska Press has re-released it so that we can sell copies here. But at this time, we don't currently have them. No.
You know how popular that was? In the 1990s, that book was still selling, the one by Stanley Vestal. And it was, at that time, Bison Book is an imprint of Nebraska.
Right.
And at that time, it was the 7th largest selling Bison book in Nebraska history. And he had, since 1947, he had sold 93,000. He was gone, but they sold 93,000 copies from 47 to like 93.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
I'm not sure who was actually saying this. I think it might have been Miller. But after Bridger took his armor off, then Joe Meek, and I'm reading from my book here, Joe Meek, who had been frequenting the alcohol kettle, mourning the loss of Mountain Land, his wife, put on Bridger's armor and strutted about as if a king of old, shouting, quote, a horse, a kingdom for a horse. The irascible Bill Williams replied, for what king, Bassonia, speak or die? And then the source says they were paraphrasing Shakespeare's Richard III and Henry IV, respectively. So they're paraphrasing. Do you know what the original quotes were, or?
I'd have to go back and look them up, but yeah, those. I had heard that. I didn't hear it in that much detail, so that's kind of cool.
Yeah, and I never went back to find the original, but I just didn't know whether you were aware of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, like I said, it was like in Robert's introduction. This was not something that was for a certain class of people. Shakespeare at the time was a common man's language, and you didn't read it quietly to yourself. The idea was it was meant to be performed, and so mountain men, not just Jim Bridger, but mountain men throughout the West. You even have the fur traders of the Hudson Bay companies of Frenchmen, reciting it in their native tongue. So Shakespeare is being performed. It's not just in like instances like that where you have two different plays playing off of each other, and they're improvising it, right? They're not quoting it word for. Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so basically, you're working with folks that are are very familiar with this language. They've learned, most of them have probably learned through oratory recitation themselves, so they're able to ad-lib it a little bit as well, just like in that instance when you're mixing two plays together. Yes, sir.
I very much enjoyed the way you organized this. You had a nice thought over the 7 stages of man. Do you know how Jim Bridger was introduced to Shakespeare?
From my research, most of it comes through his time as the Chief of Army Scouts in the U.S. Army. So places at Fort Fetterman, places like Fort Laramie, you have a lot of downtime, and so there are guys reciting it, right? But even before that, there are instances. I'm not sure how he was educated. He was an apprentice, became a blacksmith, and traveled. And so, around a campfire, a lot of times this stuff is recited or read aloud by somebody who can read it. So he may have been exposed in any number of ways.
I think the original was with Sir St. George Gore, and Gore, was talking about. I can't remember the reference, but when Bridger said something about Old Jackson, meaning the War of 1812, he said Old Jackson gave them Britishers the forkedest sort of chain lightning that they ever did see. You can just go your pile on that, Mr. Gore.
Yeah, and they're $1.75 each, and there's 14-year-old boy that was hired.
Yeah, he was. I haven't been able to figure out his whole thing, but his parents had some sort of employment at Fort Bridger, and so he was living there at that outpost in that area, and Bridger was paying him $40 a month. Yeah, it's quite a bit. You have to figure the average man at the fort is probably making somewhere between $20 and $25 a month. So this boy is making quite a steal. Now that may be because he just wanted to do the grandfatherly thing and kind of encourage this boy along. You know, I'm struggling to find who the boy was because I want to know what became of the boy. So I'm still searching that part out.
I think that Sir St. George Gore heard Jim Bridger and something 2 days back.
Oh, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, those things he kept talking about, the rivers you could cook meat in, is that Yellowstone?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
he doesn't get credit for most of this. So guys like Coulter and Glass and all these other guys will get credit for these things. Now, remember, you have to think about the first time you've been to those places, right? How are you going to go back and tell somebody who's never heard of this place what is out there? And then to go and tell all these people and then have them laugh at you because the way you describe them can't possibly be true, right? So he doesn't get credit for them, but if you look at the stories he was telling, and then compare that to what we know of Yellowstone and the Great Salt Lake and other parts of the Rocky Mountains, he's probably the first white guy that had seen these things. He wasn't perfect by any means, and I'm not putting him on a pedestal, but he was well aware of how to communicate and negotiate with Native Americans. Right? He learned their customs, he learned their languages, and he purposely set himself up throughout his life to say, I'm not going to cross these lines because if I do, this is going to be the end result. He's also the guy that nobody wants to talk about. He's the one that told Fetterman, hey, that's not the way you handle this situation. Over and over and over and over again. And then Fetterman has his incident, right? Because he didn't follow the advice of the old Army scout, Jim Bridger, right? He sets up the Bridger Trail to Bozeman, Montana, that is not necessarily in competition with the Bozeman Trail, but he knows the Bozeman Trail is going to create conflict with the Lakota, right? So, and the Northern Cheyenne.
The Bridger Trail is on the west side?
Yeah, the Bridger Trail is further west than the Bozeman Trail is. So he knows if I go over there, I'm going to create conflict, right? So I'm going to try and avoid conflict by going over here and encourage you to go that way. Now, yeah, if he needs to go to war with the natives, he's going to go to war with them. He's the chief of the United States Army Scouts, right? He's on their team. He's not on Team Great Plains Indians, right? So he'll go into battle. He'll fight. He even probably Fetterman had said, okay, Jim, how should we do this? And gave it over to him. Fetterman probably would have lived a little bit longer, right? So you have a different bit of history there with him. Where it comes into a really bad instance for him. So Bridger eventually does lose his eyesight. He has a big goiter that grows on his neck, and one of his children, who's in Missouri, comes and fetches him and returns him to Missouri, where he lives out the remainder of his life with a guide horse and a trusty dog, rocking chair facing the west, you know. And what happens the last 2 years on the Green River is there's this big group of people with a bunch of hand carts that show up, and he imbibes overnight with Mr. Brigham Young over a bottle of whiskey, or 2 or 3 or 4, who knows. And surprisingly, the next morning, Brigham Young knows where Zion is. He knows where we're going to end this wandering in the wilderness. He picks Bridger's vacation home, the one spot he's able to escape to where unmolested amongst the Ute Indians, nobody's out there to bother him. He probably enjoyed floating in the Great Salt Lake when it was much higher level than it is now. All those wonderful things, well, Brigham Young took it away from him. Not only did he take that away from him, but his handcart folks decided to set up a ferry crossing about a mile away from the Fort Bridger ferry crossing. They set up an outpost, right? And how do you compete with them? It's the people of the outpost, the guerrillas, and eventually the Mormon battalion, they would take pot shots anytime anybody used the Fort Bridger crossing into the river. You have bullets flying at your customers. But you're eventually not going to have any more customers at Fort Bridger, and they're going to come safely across at the Mormon outpost crossing, right? And then things progress, get worse. Bridger's losing his eyesight. He's in failing health, and now he's in this big war with the Mormons, essentially, who eventually burn Fort Bridger to the ground, and they kind of won the Green River crossing at that point. So until his death, he had a big grudge against Brigham Young and Mormons. If Bridger were telling the story, he was the voice of the angel Moroni. There was no angel. It was Bridger telling him where this place was that he liked to go.
The Great Salt Lake was part of Mexico at that point, right?
Yes, it was. But the issue is so the Mormons kind of take it over. There's lots of conflict that happens there. They beg for help from the United States Army. The United States Army doesn't want to get involved because it would be an international incident. And then there was also some practices that Brigham Young and his people did that they wanted to negotiate out. So it becomes a long, bigger story. But it starts with that initial night at Fort Bridger, and then the grudge began.
I think the story of the vision is more famous than Bridger was able to get out. They told the guy about Salt Lake.
Yeah, probably was.
I probably would. Thank you very
You
much.
bet. Thank you.
Yeah. Wonderful.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you for coming.
Absolutely.
May I take a picture of
Yes,
the